Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and Irina and Christina for putting together this fantastic event, and for also finding these glorious settings. And there's no, there's no better setting to speak about a palace of culture than in another palace of culture, in a very different but also a similar one in many regards. When I carried out my research on the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, I made a more or less conscious effort to not elaborate on the colonial or decolonial or post-colonial dimensions of my research. So I kind of ignored this question. There were three reasons. Maybe there were more reasons, but there were three reasons that I can isolate. I didn't want to appropriate or to suggest an equivalence between the experience of very predominantly white Poles and colonized and decolonizing populations in Asia and Africa. Or rather, I wasn't opposed to making such an equivalence, but I simply shied away from straying too deep into that territory. This post-colonial and decolonial lens in Polish academia and not just in Polish academia, I think is often associated with a rather right-wing revanchist school which deploys post-colonial lens to maximize the Polish stake to victimhood. And in particular, which deploys this post-colonial lens in a very kind of anti-communist way. So as such, it is also associated with this kind of anti-communist narrative which reduces the experience of state socialism exclusively to one of suffering or exploitation, and which renders Poles into unambiguous victims of this suffering. So my aim was to show a more nuanced story to run against the current of Polish anti-communist ideological hegemony, to show also the progressive kind of collectivity creating power of a communist building. This book was published in 2019, and the research was carried out in the decade before. There can be no doubt, however, that the colonial dimension was there. Poland was colonized by the Soviet Union in a manner which extended the prior colonial domination over it by the Russian Empire. There was economic and military extraction. There were settlers, there were complex and performative forms of tribute that were exerted and extracted. So really it's all quite clear-cut. And this kind of maritime obsession, maritime cathexis of established scholarship on colonialism prevents a discussion of the, it hasn't completely prevented this discussion, but it's worked towards preventing a systematic discussion of the equivalence between Russian, Soviet, contiguous imperialism and Euro-American colonialism. So I use the terms in this presentation and elsewhere, I use the terms in a kind of very unrigorous way. I use the terms colonialism and imperialism interchangeably to consciously move away from this kind of Robert Young, Edward Said consensus that posits a strong distinction between the terms. And that makes it more difficult, in effect, for a substantive conversation about not only Russian but also Soviet colonialism to take place in various disciplines. And it's a huge discussion, and it's gradually now beginning to turn into a different direction. And I wanted to, I cite Zhenya here in the kind of initial section of my paper, and you've already talked about this, so I won't discuss this at length now, but as Zhenya Gubkina has recently argued with reference to Freedom Square in Kharkiv, the site of Держпром, on which constructivist buildings belonging to the same ensemble as Держпром and designed, some of them by the same architect, designed by Jakob Steinberg, by a different architect, were coated in this kind of thick layer of socialist realist decor. So Zhenya writes, we need to critically evaluate the methodology with which socialist realism has been interpreted for years. Stalinism is a very important milestone in the understanding of 20th century colonialism, and Freedom Square in Kharkiv is a prime example of it. And as Zhenya showed, on the 1st of March, this building suffered a direct hit from a thermobaric vacuum missile, and it was burned out and destroyed, killing several dozen people. And so the decision that is now to be taken by Ukrainian colleagues and decision makers when this building is rebuilt. Should it be decolonized, and if so, how? Should it be returned in the process? And you raised these questions explicitly in your presentation already. Should it be returned in the process of reconstruction to its pre-war constructivist appearance? Should we even go further and restore the coherence of the Freedom Square constructivist ensemble as a whole? So how should this process of decolonization be carried out, and is it a process of de-socialist realization too? And I was fascinated the other day to read that a new body has been established by, I think, the Institute for National Remembrance in Ukraine and the Ministry of Culture, and it's called the Dvorецът, the Advisory Council for Decommunization, what are the three Ds? Decommunization, de-Russification, and decolonization. So all three together, which is an extraordinary kind of juxtaposition, especially existing in institutional form. And I suppose it's also important to remember that in his speech, the Russian President Huilo made a reference not only to denazification but also to decommunization, right? He said that Russia is here doing the business of decommunization for Ukraine. So moving onwards, on the other hand, if, however, are not constructivism and post-war modernism, not to speak of postmodernism, are also tarnished with many of the same colonial, even fascist characteristics as modernism is, and we've seen a lot of evidence and examples of that already today. Colonialism surely is more than a question of style. It is more than a question of what Jean-Louis called in his excellent presentation this morning a common aesthetic code. But there was a lot that was uniquely imperialist or colonialist about Stalinist socialist realism. Vladimir Papierny in his seminal Culture 2 shows in a kind of forensic sort of binary way the particular association that socialist realism has with violence, with conquest, with vertical models of power. Greg Castillo, especially in his still remarkably relevant and early work, also writes extensively on the remarkable similarities between Western Orientalist aesthetic practice and Soviet socialist realist ones, and he emphasizes that this affinity applies even on the level of labor practices of apprenticeship. Castillo compares the labor practices used by British architects in the Raj with local masters doing decorative work while the British architect designs the edifice, with the types of practices that occurred in the Soviet Union as well. And this is also the case in Warsaw, I mean throughout the whole realm. And perhaps there's no clearer statement of this colonial stroke imperial dimension than in the colloquial Russian name for socialist realist architecture, Stalinsky Empire, which obviously has its roots, and it's a kind of vernacular term, and no one really treats it seriously as a term of scholarly relevance, because historians dismiss it as a vernacular term. So it'll be interesting to make sense of this term as well. So, in any case, there's no doubt that the story of the coloniality of socialist realism or of socialist imperialism needs to be written, theorized, and considered much more extensively. So I will focus here on the paradoxical decoloniality of the way in which the Palace of Culture was framed as a free gift, a free lunch given by the USSR to Poland. Social anthropologists from Marcel Mauss onwards have long described how the gift is a mechanism which at once inserts the receiver in unequal power relations in relation to the giver, but on the other hand has a potential for creating a sort of far-reaching social solidarity which is lacking in societies founded upon the exchange of goods, of commodified goods. So the gift is the opposite of the commodity. And the very idea of space in socialist public culture is saturated with the logic of the gift. But the logic of the gift pervades not only in socialist contexts, as anthropologists writing more recently, including Nikolai Sorin-Chaikov and Bruce Grant, have pointed out, this logic of gift-giving, of prestation, pervaded also as much the Soviet as the Tsarist expansionist and colonialist projects. And also studies of British imperialism and French imperialism have demonstrated this, the performativeness of the gift, the durbar. All of these practices of gift-giving were very popular.
And gift in German is poison.
1 second, what's
gift in German means poison.
Ah, yes, of course. Exactly, yes. That's a very good point. I'm sure Bataille has pointed that out. Probably. Yes, that's a scary point. I wonder what's in this water. I want to flag, however, so before entering into this analysis of the gift, just kind of briefly mention several more dimensions of the palace's coloniality before entering into this analysis of the gift relation, this kind of socialist internationalism, both internationalism and socialist nationalism, which is built into the body of the palace. These are figures that are built into niches around the Congress Hall in the Palace of Culture, which represent not various Soviet national groups or Polish national minorities, but they represent the global, a kind of fetishistic distillation of the global proletariat. You have an African man, an Indian woman, a Chinese woman, a Central Asian woman, and an Arab figure. These figures are quite androgynous, actually, and I don't know, Dorota, maybe you know better, but I haven't really been able to get I mean, I'm not a historian, so I've never really looked into the origin story of these figures. But I mean, the common story that is told, the ethnographically relevant story, is that these were built for the occasion of the festival, the International Youth and Student Festival in 1955, which then also took place in Moscow in 1957, and these were built to kind of welcome the delegations of progressive youth from all over the world. On the other hand, as with all other socialist realist buildings, the Palace of Culture was meant to be socialist in content but national in form. And Lev Rudniev and his team, Igor Rozhin and his whole team of architects, went on a kind of ethnographic field trip together with a group of Polish architects by car. They traveled for 2 weeks around the Polish countryside in order to kind of learn about the Polish national style and to kind of immerse themselves in the Polish national style so that then they could lavish this Polish national style onto the Palace of Culture. So here's a photograph of Rudniev looking at the Wawel castle in Kraków. And so this is one example of their activity. These are the Renaissance attyki, as they're called in Polish, these kinds of Renaissance crenellations, which were considered from the 19th century onwards to be typical of the Polish national style, and they were kind of inflated and blown up all over the flat surfaces in the Palace of Culture. But actually many Polish observers of the time considered these Polish national additions to be the most Russian aspects of the Palace of Culture. So a famous diarist, Leopold Tyrmand, wrote in his diary, his 1954 diaries, that while this building was still being constructed and it was a very kind of just a tall building with no decorations, it looked like an American skyscraper. But then when they started adding all of these gargoyles and battlements, then this is when it began to look like this kind of Eastern Byzantine kind of cake. So precisely that which was supposed to make it look more Polish was interpreted by some Poles in an orientalizing way as being Russifying rather than the opposite. And this is sorry about the low resolution of this picture, but this is the Palace of Culture under construction in this sea of ruins. In 1952, when it began to be built, Warsaw had still largely not been rebuilt from the devastation of the war. So just to go into more detail of the story of the gifting of the Palace of Culture and Science was born at a very precise moment in time. Józef Sigalin, the chief architect of Warsaw, received a phone call from Hilary Minc, the Minister of the Interior of Poland, and he said that tomorrow Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov is going to call you up and he's going to offer to give you a great big palace, and you should say yes, but don't act too surprised, don't seem too enthusiastic, just calmly accept the offer from Molotov. So he gave him reactions on how to respond to this spontaneous offer with the appropriate level of enthusiasm. And indeed, this is the photograph on the right is not actually Molotov. This is actually Sigalin showing Bierut, who was the head of the Polish party, around, but I couldn't find a picture of Sigalin with Molotov. So, I mean, most of these guys look more or less the same. Indeed, the visit did happen. Minc walked around Warsaw with Sigalin, and a quick sentence, this is from Sigalin's memoirs, a quick sentence interjected into the conversation by Molotov. And how would you like to see here in Warsaw a tower like the ones we have at home? My reply, well, yes, I suppose we would. And there you go. And then the Palace of Culture was built. And this is just a remarkable similarity from my kind of a current research project on, ongoing research project on contemporary architecture in Moscow, the origin story of Zaryadye Park, which is an American designed park next to the Kremlin, designed by the same architects who did the High Line. There was a visit of Vladimir Putin to the demolition site of the Hotel Rossiya next to the Kremlin, which used to stand on this spot. Putin and Sobyanin walked around spontaneously, but someone had also invited thousands of journalists to watch their spontaneous perambulation, and Putin said to Sobyanin, I just had a thought. Maybe we can create a park zone right here in the center of Moscow next to the Kremlin. And Sobyanin responded, that would be really good. And this was precisely the same articulation of this act of gifting, which is the appropriate level of spontaneity is performed, and the appropriate level of gratitude is performed in return. This is very much framed in the propaganda of the time as well as the centrality of the process of the gift to the entire socialist public culture is not to be underemphasized. So this is another image from 1952, one of this kind of profusion of press images referring to the palace that were produced following the announcement of the gift, and it compares the dwie kultury, two cultures. On the left is the culture from the Soviet Union, and this is a muscular worker unfurling a big phallic palace over a Poland which is represented as being literally a field. Polska is, you couldn't get any more kind of tabula rasa than this. And then from USA, which is bombs dropping on Korea. So the gift is an absolutely central component of this culture, and this is one of the most extraordinary expressions of this idea of the gift in the press from the time, which is probably worth citing. This is from Tribuna, which is the main party newspaper. There have been many gifts, it is true. Kings, holy men, and magnates have been bestowing gifts upon each other since ancient times. But for one nation to give something to another, to simple people, never before. I have not come across another international treaty like that from 5th of April 1952. And I, accustomed to cryptic diplomatic formulations, searches despite itself for another section of this treaty, that in return the Polish government, that the other party obligates itself to, for nothing, as a proof and expression of friendship, to help a fraternal nation. The annals of diplomacy have known no such values. Perhaps one day this Warsaw Treaty will be cited as a precedent in a new chapter of international relations. So the more anthropologists have shown in their work that the more the performative non-obligation to reciprocate the gift is emphasized, the more screwed the recipient is. The more emphasis you put on how free the gift is, the more actually that enters you into a bind, because it shows that there isn't a possibility to reciprocate the gift, and there's a necessity to produce counter gifts in the form of tribute or in the form of fealty of another type. And this is a pretty extraordinarily clear expression of this. And this is another page from a skeptic's diary, Maria Dąbrowska, whose vision of the gift was relatively unenthusiastic as well, and emphasizes to the extent to which there were stories told of Soviet laborers getting into disputes with local workers, and even of committing acts of sexual violence against Polish women. So this sexual politics of the gift was written into the palace's kind of imposition on Warsaw from the very beginning. So yeah, this is I've already talked about the obligation to reciprocate and the kind of the spirit of this Maussian emphasis on the fact that every gift produces an obligation to make a counter gift, and this counter gift has a very strong architectural resonance too, but the gift also creates something else. So this is this kind of illustration of the extent to which the Palace of Culture transformed the entire urban morphology of Warsaw completely radically and imposed a totally different aesthetic, a totally different vision of urbanism on the city. But the gift also does something else. It also has a capacity to create a sense of social solidarity. It divides, it diminishes divisions between different spheres of life, in Mauss's words, between the juridical, political, aesthetic, and social, and it creates this kind of re-totalized social sphere. And this, I suggest in my work on the palace, is also an effect of the socialist gift. There is the violence that it necessitates, but there also is the creation of a substantive social solidarity, socialist and social collectivity under one roof. And in effect, the Palace of Culture still functions, this public spirit still remains in the life of the Palace of Culture today. It still functions as a socialist building, and this multiplicity as a kind of social condenser, and this multiplicity of functions within the Palace of Culture remains active to this day, more or less. And this is in part an effect of the fact that the Palace of Culture hasn't been nationalized, actually of the fact that it's remained in public ownership. So the ownership of the Palace of Culture passed from the Polish state to the city of Warsaw in 1990. So rather than being privatized, it was municipalized. And this process of municipalization was key to kind of emphasizing, mutating, and rendering solid and allowing this public spirit to linger. To conclude, in the case of Warsaw, this public spirit has provided an infrastructure thanks to which the palace has been appropriated by Warsaw. And one could call this mechanism decolonization by appropriation. This is a type of decolonization which doesn't require a stylistic transformation necessarily, but it requires a close attention paid to the ownership structure as well as to the contents of the building, as well as to the social program which occurs within the building. And this is an example of how the Palace of Culture has been, since the current government came to power, the Palace of Culture again became an object of contestation. It was removed from the main program, from the evening news, and it again became an object of kind of symbolizing something that needs to be removed, expunged from the body politic. Conversely, it also became a site of protest. This is the Palace of Culture during recent protests in defense of women's reproductive autonomy. It became a site for the demonstration of solidarity too. So perhaps a key political question for architecture today, especially in post-Soviet and post-socialist contexts, is the question of how to create, how to cultivate architecture's public spirit, a public spirit which the political economy of socialism, of state socialism, was able to create, but while jettisoning the coercive, violent dimension which is inherent to socialist public culture too. And this is an aesthetic question to some extent, but it's also a question of political ideology, of political economy, and especially a question of solidarity, I think. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.